There's a much easier way to accomplish the creation of your own banking system, and the mechanism has been around for over 200 years. It is tried and true. It is called participating, dividend-paying, whole life insurance. Every single one of those words is very important. But the problem is that very few people know how this works, including the people at the life insurance companies.
Welcome to the Bankless by Design Podcast, where we rethink money, ditch the system, and rediscover what it means to truly thrive well. I'm Tricia Miller, mom of 7, financial coach, and founder of ThriveWell. Around here, we believe wealth is more than numbers. It's about freedom, stewardship, and building a legacy that lasts. If you're ready to challenge the norm and take back control of your financial life, you're in the right place.
Hello, and welcome back to the Bankless by Design Podcast. Today, I'm with my son, Jonathan, and we are continuing through our Becoming Your Own Banker series, and we are going to be going over the section titled Creating a Bank Like the Ones You Already Know About, beginning on page 19 in Nelson's book, the 5th edition of Becoming Your Own Banker. But before we do that, I wanted to take a moment and reflect on the last few chapters. And the first one I want to mention is imagination. Nelson talks about the famous Carl Gauss when he was a young boy in school and how he used his imagination to solve the problem more efficiently than any of his classmates, obviously showing his genius and how that was tied to this idea of imagination. Then he gave us the grocery store example where we looked at what it would take to start your own grocery store business and how this is an example of a business where you are not only the owner, but a consumer of those same goods, which makes it likened to banking. If you owned the grocery store, would you be shopping down the street or would you shop at your own grocery store? Well, hopefully you and your family would all be shopping at your own grocery store and making sure that you go through the front door, not the back door, stealing the peas. And then last week, we talked about the problem. Now, in the section on the problem, Nelson spoke specifically about the problem of interest, although I would say that he does have one general statement that I think is important to remember because the problem isn't interest alone. He just took that as the one thing to focus on for the time being to introduce this concept. But the problem, he said, is that all of the items that we buy or purchase, whether we're paying cash or whether we're borrowing to pay for those items, are financed by other banking organizations. So the central problem is that we have given up the banking function. However, when it came to the interest piece, he was also trying to show us how we have been focused on trying to earn a high rate of return with a small little bit of our income, rather than recognizing the fact that in interest alone, the average American is losing 34.5 cents on every single dollar. But we don't pay any attention to that. We just work on saving that 5% and trying to make 8 or maybe 10% off of that little sliver. And he shows us what foolishness that is when he gives us the airplane analogy. It's like trying to go 5 miles an hour faster while flying right into a 345 mile an hour headwind. We're actually going backwards. I think there's a lot of people today who feel just like that. They sense that they're flying into a headwind, right? It feels like 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards. I think it's worse than that, but that kind of gets to that problem. And so today we're going to look at what it would look like to create our own banking system to actually take over the banking function in our lives. He gets us to use our imaginations to think about what would it look like if we actually created our own bank just like the ones that we see on the corner. So if you're going to create a bank like the ones you already know about, Nelson says it's going to cost you a lot of money. And I do think that is why when we go into our local bank and we're banking, we have never even given it a second thought that we might actually be able to start our own bank. We see the plush buildings. We can't even fathom the amount of money that is going through that banking system. How in the world could we possibly ever start our own bank? So Nelson goes through this, and some of this will sound a little bit familiar to starting the grocery store. So what was the first thing, Jonathan, that you might remember that he said, if we're going to start the grocery store business, what did we need to do?
Well, first of all, you're going to need to know the business that you're in. So you need to be educated in whatever you're going to be putting your time, money, and resources into. So you need to spend time learning how to be a banker.
That's right. He talks about that. You first have to get a firm grip on this business. You need to study it, know what it is all about so that you can properly run this business. He says, next, you're going to need some capital, money, and it had better be in the order of $20 million or more. That's a lot of money.
You got that lying around, Mom? Pocket change?
Sure, no problem. Let me just tap into that over there behind
It's under
that.
the mattress. It's all right.
Right. Okay. Then he says it's going to have to sit in liquid form, meaning that it's not even going to be money that can be in real estate or something like that, because you're going to need access to it. So while your $20 million you would really want to have invested in something worthwhile, you're actually going to have it sit in somebody else's bank, earning a very little return while you're trying to apply for your bank charter. And he says, keep in mind that the commissioner doesn't hand out charters indiscriminately. In fact, he says your chances of actually getting a charter, even if you have that much money, is 100 to 1. Because there's too many other folks who also want to be bankers.
Sorry, here, if I may, I would say something that I think we're brushing over that 20 million a little easily. I think if you actually use your imagination and kind of think it through a little bit, I don't think your celebrity F1 driver, whatever, that has 20 million is going to go and be like, you know what, I'm creating a bank. That's what I'm going to do this month. I think it's your savvy businessman that's gone and found investors, and, you know, the amount of effort that you'd have to do to pull together that kind of capital. I think that, you know, just take a pause there a little bit and think about how much effort and time that would actually take you. And Nelson kind of hints a little bit with the commissioner that, you know, a lot of things happen behind closed doors with him. Maybe you got to take him for some steak dinners, you know, some nice nights out, but you're going to have to do the exact same thing with all of your investors. So there's going to be so much time, effort, doting, you know, I mean, it's, so I just kind of thought that a little bit.
Scenes, right?
$20 million is going to take a little bit to gather. Yeah.
Yes. And he says years are likely to have passed before you finally win the coveted charter. In the meantime, you also have to get a good location and a suitable building. Just like the grocery store, you want a nice looking building, except for a bank, probably talking a far more impressive building, because you have to give this impression that your bank is solid and stable and well funded before you're ever going to get anybody to deposit their money into your bank. So you might want to get some marble floors in that building.
I was just about to say, you better make sure your marble columns are bigger than the next guy's marble columns.
Right? This is true. And so even after you do all of this, you're finally in business as a bank. Now you're going to have to advertise your bank. So your expenses still aren't finished. And if you're going to encourage people to deposit money in your bank, you're probably going to have to give some kind of extra incentive, such as paying them a higher interest rate in order for them to consider starting with a new bank. So,
I mean, Capital One uses what? Charles Barkley, Samuel L. Jackson. Trying to think about what other famous actors and actresses that they use for their commercials. So yeah, advertising is not going to be cheap either.
You have a good imagination, Jonathan.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny because most commercials these days are banks, betting, insurance, or pharmaceuticals. That's your big four. So you see lots of banking commercials, honestly. And to your point of, you have to be incentivizing, you have to be, capturing this audience, because it's a very competitive market too.
I'll say so. So he ends this paragraph with, do you notice thus far that you have been paying out money for years in getting this business established? So Nelson then goes on to talk about Adam Smith's book, Paper Money, and he says a banker cannot make a loan unless he has a deposit. In other words, banks don't lend their own money. All of this that we've talked about, incentivizing people to make deposits, they've got to get some deposits in that bank before they can begin lending. He goes on to explain, when you start up a bank, you have to put in some capital. Then you get some deposits, and then you lend the deposits. In a proper bank, these three items bear a prudent relation to one another. So capital, deposits, and lending, those are the three that have to be in appropriate relationship to one another. I'm going to let you read from there for a little bit, Jonathan, and we'll kind of explain that in this next paragraph.
Yeah, Nelson kind of fleshes out that with a little bit of an example here. So if you are a little country bank with a capital of $100,000, it would be very imprudent of you to loan Brazil $50 million. So you want a prudent relationship between the capital and the assets, which is to say the loans on the books and between the loans and the deposits. In the Western countries, the financial agents of the governments are there with their definition of prudence. Yes, there are financial agents of the government with a definition of prudence, but yet they still did not preclude massive bank failures in the mid-1980s in America. During this same time, the Asian banking community could do no wrong. They were hailed as financial geniuses, and now there are bank failures in Asia that are much greater than those that occurred in the U.S. My point is that we are not dealing here with man-made laws. They have failed miserably. We are dealing with relations among people, i.e. God-made laws. You disobey them at your peril. A case comes to mind. In September of 1983, the First National Bank of Midland, Texas, the richest city in America per capita at that time, had a loan portfolio of $1.5 billion, and 26% of those loans were non-performing, i.e. they were not getting their money back. This is a big downer in the banking business. When this sort of thing happens, someone has to support the situation, which is normally the function of the stockholders. Because of the losses, the stockholders' equity lost 87% of its value, down to $12 million. Remember the prudent relationships that Adam Smith outlined above. $12 million in capital in relation to $1.3 billion in loans is a shaky bank. When the public found out about it, can you predict what happened to bank deposits at First National at this time? Right, they decreased by $500 million. Remember that this is what banks lend, deposits made by their customers. This accelerated their decline.
Okay. Keep in mind, the loans on the books for a bank are actually their assets, which is a little backwards to our thinking as consumers because we're used to loans being a liability.
Yep. But a deposit is a liability.
Right. The deposit is the liability for the bank. The loan is the asset because that is money incoming. So what happened here in these non-performing loans from the First National Bank? 26% of their loans are no longer bringing in income. So now the stockholders realize they're not making profits. They actually have losses on the books. Then the public finds out that the bank is on shaky ground, which only means that the depositors now grab their money and run. So now you've got a spiraling situation that went from bad to worse. So
you've lost your assets and your liabilities are coming due at the same time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. This all sounds pretty ominous, but you haven't seen anything yet. So Nelson is going to explain a little bit here about the fractional reserve system. But before we get into this, Johnny, I know you wanted to share a little bit about how the banking industry got started in the first place.
Yeah, I thought this was a good opportunity to just kind of lay out a very rudimentary understanding of what is banking, why is banking necessary, if it's just this hodgepodge of evil, just abandon the banks, right? Let's just get rid of it. But the reality is that it does serve a necessary function that throughout all of humanity, we have circled back to the same issue. Think back to pre-modern eras, pre any form of money or currency where that was being used as a means of exchange. The only way to exchange goods or services was through barter, by, exchanging one good for another, or by exchanging a service for a good or a service for another service. So if a farmer wanted clothes, he had to take something to the tailor that the tailor needed, whether that be, the tailor needed a goat because he needed to perform a sacrifice or he needed a cow to feed his family, whatever.
How about some eggs?
Yeah, some eggs. Yeah, he maybe just needed some eggs. But say that at the time, the tailor had no need for anything that the farmer had. Well, then how is the farmer going to get his clothes? Well, he needs some other form of exchange. So now at this point, he's going to have to go and barter with somebody else to get something that the tailor needs to then go take to the tailor and barter with the tailor. So all this is very time consuming and very inefficient. So people found other ways to create a means of exchange. So that could have been shiny objects like shells or nice rocks or useful items like perhaps weapons, like ammo or something like that, that represented a common means of exchange. So then quickly we find things that hold more value inherently, so things like gold and silver, so these things that do not tarnish. So then gold and silver start to become the more common means of exchange. There's a lot more that goes into that. There's religious aspects, there's commerce.
There's also a scarcity factor that made gold valuable.
Yes, it's finite, right?
Right.
So all these things come into play where now we have a common means of exchange, and this common means of exchange is very heavy and cumbersome and not easy to carry around with you. So now you're having to carry a giant chest with you with all of your gold and silver because you can't leave it at home because there's no smart camera watching your gold and silver. So, now go ahead.
I was going to say, and now you're going to get robbed on the road.
I was going to say, now you have to travel with an armed guard and you have to pay for an armed guard because you're carrying your whole entire life savings with you in gold and silver when you travel to visit your aunt. So that's just not going to work, right? So there became a need to store this wealth safely. So this is where a bank comes in. It was originally just a warehouse of wealth. It was a location to store your gold and silver.
And I've even heard it started with the goldsmiths.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. They had brands where they could validate their gold. And so that's kind of how the goldsmiths were involved. They were creating the coins and the bars, and so then they were kind of seen as a credible place. And so then, they decided to offer a service because, like you said, they saw an opportunity where, everybody needs to store their gold. I can do that. I'll hire the guard, And so, so the goldsmith starts, and then it becomes, there's clearly a need here. So just like any free market, a need is noticed and it's fulfilled, right? So then banks start creating. And originally, you paid them to keep your gold and your silver for you, keep it safe. And that was a simple exchange. They keep it safe, you pay for it. So when they put their gold into this warehouse, they were given an IOU, a little ticket that said what your amount of gold was that you had on deposit. And that could be exchanged for your gold.
You could take it back and you could go get your gold.
Exactly.
For that
so
ticket.
That's how you know it was gold backed, was that you could go and exchange it. And so then people recognized in their day-to-day lives that rather than going and running to the bank or to the goldsmith to get the gold to then go do a transaction, hey, I can just give you my IOU certificate and that covers my debt. And so people quickly found that, hey, this piece of paper is so much easier to carry around and transport and exchange with each other. And so it just became a natural means of exchange. Very quickly, the banks caught on to this and saw that this was a good opportunity. And again, I don't think that it was necessarily nefarious at this point yet or anything like that, but they were like, they could
Not everybody's coming to turn in their tickets all at once.
Yes, exactly. So they were like, well, with this other gold that I have, I can go and invest it and start making more money with this gold and buy whatever. And, and then I'll make sure that I'm making a profit as a good banker. And when people come back, I'll still have more money to give them their money back. And so there just became this there used to be a natural rule that you only gave out the gold that they actually had. But as Mom said, they realized that not everybody was coming for the gold all at once. So they just started being able to lend it to other people that had not placed a deposit or that they could then go and invest it, right? And so then they were giving out the money. And so then it kind of became a thing where they were paying people to come and bring their gold and silver because they were going and making more money utilizing that gold and silver. So long story short is that there ended up being an intermediary, another means of exchange. The gold and silver was replaced with a paper currency, this IOU. And then eventually the gold and silver did not back that piece of paper anymore. And that's where we get into more modern history. But I just felt that was necessary to just kind of explain how we got here and why we need a bank and why we need a means of exchange.
Okay, that sounds good. Now, this section here is where Nelson is going to get into this fractional reserve banking system as we know it today. And actually, I think it's gotten almost a little bit worse than what he actually has here. So let me just read what Nelson says here. This all sounds pretty ominous, but you haven't seen anything yet. He was referring back to, of course, the First National Bank of Midland, Texas. You must add the multiplier effect of bank lending practices. Practically no one is aware that when you make a deposit of $1,000 at your favorite bank, they can now lend out $10,000 as a result of your deposit. It is called the fractional reserve lending system. That is, they are creating money out of thin air. My own description of what they are doing is the world's largest con game. It is all predicated on the theory that everyone is not going to withdraw their money at the same time. For a complete treatise on what is going on in banking, I suggest, no, I beg you to read The Case Against the Fed by Murray Rothbard. You can get it at the Ludwig von Mises Institute located in Auburn, Alabama. So Nelson is begging people. But this fractional reserve lending system it has become a privilege, shall we say, of the bankers that they get to lend money. Now remember, lending is how they make their money. So they are profiting off of the fact that when you deposit $1,000, they can lend out $10,000. If the individual person tried to do this, we would go to jail for
fraud.
For fraud. That's right. But somehow the bankers have managed to get in bed with the government, shall we say, so that they have this special privilege where they can just inflate the money supply. Their earnings necessarily are earned on the poverty of the people. Their increasing riches are being built on the ever-increasing poverty of the average person, because inflation hurts the person at the bottom the most. Perhaps this is why Nelson says, I beg you to read The Case Against the Fed. One of the things Nelson says here is that they're creating money out of thin air.
Yeah, that's what I was going to kind of circle back to. It wasn't so much that the bankers realized day one that they could go to a 10% deposit and then go and do fractional reserve with 90%. This was a gradual move. In the very beginning, they weren't being super imprudent with what they were having lending out. And it just kind of became this slippery slope where, oh, well, they still all haven't come at once. It still hasn't really happened.
Right.
Well, now we can get to 60-40. Well, now we can get to 50-50. And then I do know it was written into law at one point that the reserve was only 10% that was necessary. And I think that that's just kind of a suggestion
not even there
at
anymore.
This point. Yeah.
Right. That's what I've heard as well.
Yeah. And that's where a lot of these modern issues come from. And there's such a jump from the gold back to the removal of a gold back currency that we still pretended to be a gold back currency until all the other nations in the world threatened to come and, say our loans are due. And Nixon, finally was like, okay, we're going off the gold standard. I'll admit it.
1971.
Like, yeah, it took him literally getting his arm twisted by France. Was like, really? You have that much gold? You have enough gold to cover what we owe? Fractional reserve banking really took off when we removed ourselves from the gold standard, because now there was not even
there was nothing to tether that to.
Yes. Now it's a completely unlimited. They claim that the backing of the dollar is the GDP, basically. It's what our country's ability to produce is. So, or you could say that the U.S. military backs the U.S. dollar now, or oil, right? There's Bretton Woods to where everything was tied back to the U.S. dollar on the global scale. That's where we had to basically tie oil to it. And there's so much history here. And I think that's what Nelson's screaming at us to go run and read about it, because there is many a good books. The Creature of Jekyll Island, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, The Case Against the Fed by Murray Rothbard. There's tons of good books on this. And Ron Paul tells us that this is what has led us into these endless wars, is that
Yes.
it's this ability to infinitely print money because there's nothing that's preventing them from doing it anymore. And so with Vietnam, it just fueled this military industrial complex and became the beast, that could not be satisfied. And it became this endless cycle, right, of the classic revolving door in government where everybody is tied between governments and board of directors of companies. And I'll get off my soapbox soon, but what I want to say is that recognizing that this necessary service that we all require in our daily lives is unfortunately a tool for the most destructive thing in the entire world and is pretty much the conduit for it to happen. Without the ability to use fractional reserve banking and to have an infinite reserve, so to speak, to print from, because guess what? We're $38+ trillion in debt now. And like, it's just okay. Like, we can just keep doing it and keep doing it. And that's, the problem that allows this to happen. So I'm bringing this to everybody's attention as a call to starve the beast and to reduce our contribution as much as possible. Because when I see money from our country being used to indiscriminately bomb a city that is more densely populated than New York City, that has a population of 11 million people, it's heinous, wrong, and I can't stand to even think about anything I do contributing even remotely to it. So it's just incredibly important that we find alternate means to do this incredibly necessary service, task, function of our lives. And I'll stop my soapbox.
No, it's okay.
But
You mentioned something you were saying at Chick-fil-A this afternoon.
yeah.
So back up, because you were talking about your buddy at work and your sisters.
Yeah, I was just, I felt the need to talk about this today because I was at work and I'm at lunch and I'm just sitting there with my coworker and we both make a okay wage. I don't really know exactly what he makes, but I assume I make right around the same. And I open my phone and I can watch missiles and bombs being used both defensively in the Iron Dome or being used aggressively in Iran that range from $15,000 to $16 million plus. And you can't even fathom the sheer amount of money that we are spending to kill other human beings, regardless of whatever you think. And
that's right.
There's people here in this country, like my siblings, who, can't be a stay-at-home mom because everything is so incredibly expensive and that they have to work 2 jobs and they have to work super hard. But you want me to get behind spending how many billions of dollars to send an aircraft carrier halfway across the world to a country that most people in this country can't even point out on a map and to just indiscriminately bomb it? What is that doing for you, me, or any of our neighbors or siblings or brothers? And
let's not fool ourselves. Those are our dollars.
Yeah, exactly. That's
they're
our
using.
money.
The government doesn't have money of its own.
No.
It
doesn't own a business. It doesn't produce.
Is backed by our labor. Guess what? We're just having to work harder and harder. It is on our backs. And I'm just as passionate about this as you are. And I think that's why Nelson is saying, I beg you to read this. We have to start understanding what is happening because we're contributing to it. We don't do that intentionally. People don't understand. But when you do, it will make you want to create a bank of your own, like the ones you already know about, except it can be an honest bank.
Yeah.
And I like what you said there about you can stop contributing to this. Death and destruction is really what it is. Just one more fine point on that. Bankers support both sides of a war and they make money off of both sides. So when Nelson says, get the snakes and dragons out of your life, I mean, he can't put enough exclamation points behind that sentence in my mind. All right.
Amen. We'll move on. Circling back to not being an honest banker, the First National Bank example. So they hired a new CEO to come in and put out the fire, but it was too late. 2 months later, they were out of business. A more complete picture of what happened to this bank appeared in the December issue of a drilling magazine. Reading between the lines, it was pretty evident that a lot of those non-performing loans were made to the members of the board of directors. They were making loans to themselves to invest in the oil business where they were going to make a killing and neglecting to repay the loans. There was a big energy crisis just a while before this, and when the oil business returned to normal, these folks lost both their oil business and their banking business. Had they repaid their loans plus interest, their bank would have still been in operation, but greed prevailed and did them in. All banks that went bankrupt during that period in record quantities were just a variation of what happened here.
And many banks have failed since then as well. Nelson's talking about the 1980s here, but we can all recollect the 2008, 2009 era when we had a similar situation. We have had more banks fail even recently. We've got the Silicon Valley Bank and different examples like that. But it's the board of directors themselves. It's the bankers who were actually borrowing the bank's money. And so you can see when he talks about the greed got them, I would imagine they were borrowing a significant amount of money and risking it in the oil business. And then when that did not turn out the way they expected, they not only lost in the oil business, but they lost their bank as well. So the lesson there for us as we become our own banker is to remember that it is the human behavior that is really the biggest risk with becoming your own banker. You must be an honest banker. Do not borrow against your policy for something very risky with no plan to pay it back, no ability to pay it back. That's the lesson I get from there. I also think it speaks to perhaps the education piece. You know, a lot of our investments, if it's something that we are educated in, then we already have mitigated the risk. But if we are just, gambling away that money because we're getting into something we know nothing about and we're being foolish, that may be a little bit of what is happening here as well. Maybe they didn't know as much about it as they thought they did, or they were over leveraging. I like to tell people, I don't borrow against 100% of the amount available in my policy. I want to leave a reserve there so that I'm not overextending myself, so that if another emergency arises, I still have some liquidity there that I can handle what might come. Then he goes on to talk about how getting into the banking business is very time-consuming and expensive. But people wouldn't do it if it wasn't profitable over the long haul. So yes, when you think about that, raising that $20 million or more, everything that we talked about in the beginning that you go into, there's a lot of years that goes by before you ever make a dime. Okay. But what he's going to say now is that was a lot of effort. There's a way to create your own banking business that is much, much easier than all of this. Let me just read this here. He says, there's a much easier way to accomplish the creation of your own banking system, and the mechanism has been around for over 200 years. It is tried and true. It is called participating, dividend-paying, whole life insurance. Every single one of those words is very important. But the problem is that very few people know how this works, including the people at the life insurance companies, which is astonishing to actually say, but it's true. We have thought about life insurance as a death benefit, protection for your family. We have neglected to understand the living benefits, especially of this particular type of whole life insurance. Participating, that is dividend paying, because it's mutually owned. You are not only an owner of that contract, but you are an owner in the company when you take out a policy. Therefore, when they pay dividends, they pay them to the policy owners, just like a bank pays dividends to their stockholders. Only in this case, you're like the stockholder of the life insurance company. And then at this point, he says it helps if you understand what is meant by the word cogeneration. And he talks about it in regard to a paper mill. Well, I remember my brother-in-law worked at the paper mill in Port Angeles, Washington. And I remember as a little girl getting a tour of the paper mill. You'd see the trees come in and they'd slice those trees, but you have this bark on the trees that they don't need. And this bark is very flammable though. So they have to do something with it. They might as well use it. So essentially, this bark becomes a source of fuel and it can produce electricity. So every sawmill of significant size and all paper mills have a cogeneration plant to make their own electricity. Imagine that you own a paper mill and that the cogeneration plant can produce 125% of your mill's need for electrical power. So here you have all of this spark. How foolish would it be for you to just throw it away? Instead, it's going to produce electricity, which is going to cut the cost of the paper mill because now you're going to be able to produce your own electricity. But what if you produce 125%? So you've got an additional 25% beyond what you need. Well, you can sell that. To do so, are you going to set up your own electric company, power distribution plant? No, you're just going to tap into the electric company that's already in existence and just sell the power to the electric company, let them distribute it, and still make a profit from that. So creating your own banking system through the use of dividend-paying whole life insurance is much like that cogeneration. The life insurance company already has everything in place that you need to conduct the banking function in your life. You don't have to actually build this bank on the corner and do all of the things that we talked about at the beginning of this chapter. Instead, you can tap into the life insurance company. You can decide to take out a policy, pay a premium, borrow against it. Now you have your own banking system. Again, imagination is at play here. You have everything you need. The administration, there's service people who answer the phone at the other end. They've got the building on the corner. They've got the actuaries. They're bearing all of the risk. My friend Becca Wilhite likes to say, the hardest thing you got to do is just wake up, pay a premium. Everything else is done for you. The best part is that you can take over this banking function yourself, solves your need for finance, all of that money that was flowing through your hands going to a third-party bank, making them wealthy at the cost of you and your neighbors. I like this idea of creating my own system. Doesn't happen overnight. Still takes a little time. But that dividend-paying whole life insurance contract is your cogeneration plant for your own banking system. Jonathan, do you have any final thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, I think he lays it out here that we do not have to go through the rigor and intense process of trying to actually establish a physical bank, quite frankly, and that we can utilize these systems that have already existed to take over this banking function in our lives, and that, don't reinvent the wheel, right? That there's already this framework. Let's utilize it and let's build a system on top of it.
Let's just tap into it. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And Nelson said it previously. You don't have to be wealthy to become your own banker. Next time, we're going to talk about creating your own banking system through dividend-paying whole life insurance. And Nelson is going to give us a little bit more of a under-the-hood inspection of dividend-paying whole life insurance. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate your contributions. So, thank you for that.
Thanks so much for having me, Mom. I really appreciate it.
Until next time, I hope you all have a great week, and thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we're done with the system and we're doing money differently. Be sure to subscribe, share this episode with someone who needs it, and visit us at banklessbydesign.com to learn how you can start living bankless by design.